So that's kind of where we're at. But now let's say, so we've got all these controls in place, but let's say an embezzlement happens. How should a church respond to embezzlement?
Well, in my experience, and I've dealt probably with hundreds of these cases over the years, they fall into two groups. A small minority of churches, when they know or suspect a case of embezzlement, will immediately contact the local prosecutor, sometimes contact the IRS. That's one way you can respond. But what I've found is that probably 95% or more of churches, when they know of or suspect a case of embezzlement, they don't want to turn this person over to the police, to the prosecutor. They don't want to contact the prosecutor. They don't want to contact the IRS. They want to deal with it internally. And this may be a grandmother. You want her to go on the rock pile, like that case we talked about last month, for 8 years, for stealing $3,000 from her church? I still think about that woman with that sledgehammer. Like, it's just, where's my grandchildren? It's horrible. So church leaders recoil from this. We're merciful. We want to forgive this person. And so what they typically do is say, well, if you tell us how much you took and you agree to pay it back, sometimes we'll have you sign a promissory note, unsecured, then everything's going to be fine. Well, that's the most common response, Jerry. But let me just mention 4 issues with respect to that response. First, you need to have a good idea of what was taken before you utilize that particular response. It's premised on you knowing what that person took. How do you know that? You're going to take the word of a thief? So what I think you have to do is get a good estimate of what was taken, a reliable, a credible estimate. And the best way to do that is to hire a certified fraud examiner, a CFE. You can go to the Certified Fraud Examiner website and find the nearest CFEs to your location. These are typically CPAs that have forensic training on identifying fraudulent activity and who's responsible and how much was taken. It's not going to be 100% accurate, but it's the best chance you've got of quantifying what was taken without having to rely on the words of a thief. So that's something I recommend. The second point I'd make about this response is if you have that person sign a promissory note agreeing to pay that $50,000 back, just remember that in essence is a loan. And many churches have in their governing documents a provision that requires loans to be approved by the congregation. So you can't even consider this option unless you are prepared in many churches to go forward to the congregation. You can't keep it secret like many church leaders want to do. You got to go to the congregation and explain what has happened. Grandma Smith has stolen $50,000. We don't want to do that. Well, then you have to take this option off the table then. And then the third point I would make is what if the embezzler doesn't pay the money back that she or he has agreed to do? Well, then you're left with the difficult options of informing the prosecutor or taking it to the IRS. And also number 4 is to recognize that the church board each member has a fiduciary duty to the church. You are set apart by the congregation to be leaders, to be representatives of the body. And so you are held to very high standards in the performance of your duties. You are stewards of the church's resources. And to just willy-nilly let somebody walk off having stolen $50,000 from the church, that is unthinkable. And remember, churches as public charities can only expend their finances, their assets, their funds for purposes that are consistent with their exempt purposes. So, how is it consistent with your exempt purposes to forgive a $50,000 debt to an embezzler? It's not. That's a violation of not just a sacred trust of fiduciary duties, but also of your legal and tax duties under the Internal Revenue Code, that your assets are used for exempt purposes.
One of the things that I see...
Let me make one other point.
Okay, go ahead.
And that is this, that your church is financed almost entirely, if not entirely, by charitable contributions from members. What is their expectation? Their expectation is their contributions why are they making the contributions? So that the church can utilize them in the performance and the exercise of its exempt purposes. And to the extent they know what's going on, many members would be offended and outraged that my contributions, or some portion of them, are going to forgive a $50,000 debt to an embezzler. So that's got to be considered as well.
One of the things, and I know that most churches like to err on forgiveness of people and stuff like that, but how many of the lawsuits that we've seen where a person stole from one church, was forgiven from that church, goes to another church and steals again? So you got to realize that if you forgive somebody for stealing and you don't do anything about it, there's a good chance that they go to another church and this happens all over again.
You are facilitating it. There's a line in Timon of Athens, one of Shakespeare's lesser-known plays, where one of the figures says, "Nothing emboldens sin as much as mercy." Nothing emboldens sin as much as mercy. I've never forgotten that line. And it is so true. And there was a case we talked about last month of a church administrator that embezzled $850,000. And the court, in sentencing that guy to 32 years in prison, said they commented on the fact that this guy had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars in a previous church that decided to forgive him. And the judge said, and that is what facilitated this crime. That judge spoke with derision over how that prior church had handled this.
Absolutely.
You know, Jerry, you mentioned earlier the importance of background checks. Let's say you've taken that approach, Rich, and you're trying to forgive the embezzler. What happens down the road if you get a reference request for that person? What would be the proper way to respond?
Well, and many churches they're fearful of providing references under those circumstances, but you can do so in a way that's legally safe. And the way that, I think the best way to handle that, when you have vital information that you feel it's important for you to share to protect that other congregation where this guy now wants to work in a position involving access to funds anyway, the way to handle that, I think, in a legally safe manner is to agree to provide a reference contingent upon that individual signing a release, releasing you and the former church from any liability for what you share in that reference. And what's going to happen is the pastor of Church B will ask that individual to sign such a release. He won't do it. And that raises the flag up the pole, the red flag of concern. And that's the way it's done today. In a legally safe manner.
So let's say somebody does forgive a debt. Is this considered taxable income to those people because actually they've received that income? Can you talk about some of the tax implications?
So what happens in these cases? 95% plus that hundreds of cases I've worked with, the church doesn't turn it over to a prosecutor or the IRS. They want to forgive the person. They want the person, oh, well, I'll pay it back. They don't know how much was taken, and there's just some ambiguous intent to pay it back. Occasionally there's a promissory note that's signed. But the fact is, the person ends up not honoring the obligation. Almost always that happens. And so then the church leaders wonder, should we they forgive the debt? And is that taxable income? Yes, the forgiveness of debt is a taxable transaction. It's taxable income. And so you have to report the amount of the forgiven debt as taxable income. Now, the problem is, in cases of embezzlement, you typically don't know how much was taken. Even if you have a CFE assisting you, you have a ballpark estimate. Not enough, in many cases, for you to put something on a W-2 or 1099 as to the amount of the income. And so, Jerry, what the IRS recommends in these cases, and I've spoken with the national office on this, is that you file what's called the Form 3949A, 3949-A, which is called an information referral form. You're not expected, you're not required by law to determine exactly what was taken. And since you don't know with exactitude what was taken, you can't report anything on a 1099 or W-2. The IRS, with that form, will initiate an investigation, and ultimately they have resources, they have the power to inspect bank records and to determine with a great deal of accuracy how much was taken, looking at deposits, et cetera. And so that is probably the best option that you've got. That's what the IRS National Office has told me. That's your best option when embezzlement is suspected. So
actually, let's say we've notified, we've we've had an embezzlement. Let's talk to our insurance agent. So we're going to notify the insurance agent. A lot of people don't know that do they have employee dishonesty coverage, so or what is called an employee dishonesty bond. So that amount of insurance actually does not go year to year. So let's say, for instance, we had $100,000 worth of coverage over the last 7 years. Each year we renewed that bond. And the average theft is over a 7-year period. So they say, well, they stole $100,000 every 7 years. I should have $700,000 worth of insurance because I've got coverage for all that. But there's a little thing in the insurance policies that state the last insurance that is applicable is the one that picks up all the previous years. So again, you might think that you have a lot of coverage, but it's the last policy that's in effect that would have all the coverage. So if you went from $1 million worth of coverage to $100,000 worth of coverage, you're still only going to have that $100,000, even though people may have stolen over a long time. So you need to notify your insurance agent of what's happened. If they have a confession, give the confession to the insurance company. Your insurance company will pay you, but here's something that a lot of people don't understand when it comes to insurance companies. They have to be willing to prosecute the perpetrator. If you're not willing to prosecute, you're not going to collect your insurance. So if you're going to buy the insurance, you better be willing to prosecute.
Let me address, in our closing minutes here, one other very, very important issue that comes up in all these cases. This is one of the main reasons churches contact me when they know of a case of embezzlement. And the question is, how do we inform the staff? How do we inform the congregation? Here's a person that's been a faithful member or employee of the church for maybe decades, highly respected, and now all of a sudden, this person has been removed from his or her position within the church, maybe even membership within the church, and people are asking questions. What happened to this person? And church leaders often are fearful of responding, are reluctant to respond, they're reticent because they fear that liability. We're going to get sued for defamation. Let me share a few comments about this with you. Number one is the important principle of qualified privilege. And the courts have said almost uniformly that when you share information in a church with members only on matters of common interest to the membership of the church, you are clothed with a qualified privilege, meaning you can't be liable for what is communicated under those circumstances unless you do so maliciously, meaning you share information that you know is false, which hardly ever happens. So the key here is you can have an informational meeting of the members of the church, and you've got to take steps to ensure that only members, in fact, are present. I would recommend that it not be recorded, because that could fall into the hands of non-members. And so the First Amendment guarantee of religious freedom provides an important protection to you under those circumstances in sharing factual information, not opinions, not assumptions, not inferences, but factual information. That's a very important point to keep in mind. If you're going to share with the congregation, be sure you do so only to members of the church. Number two, I recommend you get a signed confession from the individual that includes a statement that you can read this confession to the congregation. I've utilized that approach in many cases. When the person is confronted and confesses, at that moment, there's an opportunity for you to have the person sign a confession. They're contrite, they're embarrassed, they're ashamed, they're guilty. And if you have I recommend you have the document, the confession, in advance prepared, so you can just flip it across the table. They'll sign it, believe me. I've seen this happen countless times. Now, let me make one other point here, and that is that sometimes a person will come and speak to the pastor and confess. Maybe you didn't even know that there was embezzlement going on. Somebody comes to the pastor, a staff member, a bookkeeper, and says, "Pastor, I just can't live with myself anymore. I've embezzled $10,000 or $50,000, $100,000 from the church." You've got to be very careful with that information. If it's communicated to the pastor in a privileged conversation, by that I mean shared with the pastor in confidence, acting in his professional capacity as a spiritual advisor, which is true in many of these confessional cases. You just can't take that information to the board. In fact, that happened in one case, and a church was found liable for a substantial amount because a church financial employee did communicate to the pastor that she had stolen $50,000, and the church was found liable for much more than that because the pastor had breached that duty of confidentiality by disclosing that information to the board. So if you receive information in the process of a confession that's protected by the clergy privilege, do not share that with anybody without that person's, I would say, written permission. Now, that doesn't mean you stop the investigation. You can still pursue the investigation. You know who this person is guilty. You can find evidence by other means, but you can't use that confession.